Grim discovery that may be tied to a decades-old mystery. Human remains were found at a building next to the Vatican embassy in Rome.
Inside the Vatican's main church, a simple plan to adjust a burial space quietly became a hidden excavation under the floor. For 10 years, workers dug out of sight and uncovered a forgotten world tombs, pagan shrines, and bones some believe belonged to St. Peter himself.
We have burials, including, of course, the famous burials underneath St. Peter's Church.
But deeper down, they found something even harder to explain, a structure that may be older than Rome itself. The secret dig under the Vatican. In early 1939, Pope Pius XI died in Rome. He wanted to be buried under St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican grottos, close to the tomb of Pope Pius X. The grottos are an older level under the church floor, lined with chapels and papal tombs, directly beneath the main altar. To honor Pius XI's wish, workers would have to lower part of the floor in that crowded area. The new pope, Pius XII, agreed to make room. Engineers and architects from the office that oversees the basilica reviewed the plans and saw trouble right away. The spot they had to cut into lies almost directly under the high altar and the huge dome. Above them rose one of the largest stone domes ever built, reaching about 448 feet from the floor to the top of the cross and weighing around 14,000 tons of masonry. Around the altar sits Bernini's bronze canopy, the tall, twisted column baldachin that marks the heart of the church, about 100 feet high and roughly 63 tons of bronze and iron. All of that weight flows down into foundations that run through the very ground they were being asked to disturb. If they weakened even one support, cracks could run through the floor or up into the pillars. So the work could not be rushed. It would have to be slow, careful, and above all, quiet. For that reason, the Vatican did not bring in an outside contractor. It turned to the Sampietrini, St. Peter's men. This small corps of workmen, often from families who had served there for generations, looked after the basilica day after day and knew every stair, roof, and passage in the building. In late 1939 and early 1940, as war broke out across Europe, the Sampietrini began to dig. The order came straight from the Pope and a tiny circle of advisors. The air was damp, the ceilings were low, and light came from work lamps. The men dug with shovels and pickaxes, hauling each bucket of soil by hand and bracing each new gap with fresh concrete and steel so that nothing above would move. Soon, their tools struck something hard and curved. It wasn't natural rock. It was man-made brickwork. Work stopped while the architects climbed down. When they opened a wider hole and shone lights inside, they saw that they were standing on the roof of older buildings. Those structures did not belong to the Renaissance church that people see today. They were part of the first St. Peter's, the basilica begun by Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century and torn down in the 1500s. What almost no one had pictured was the price Constantine had paid in earth and stone to build his church on this hill. In his time, the Vatican slope was uneven and dropped toward the Tiber River. To set a huge church across that slope, his builders cut into the hill on one side and raised the ground on the other. They poured in a man-made hill of rubble, soil, broken stone, and old construction waste, probably more than 1 million cubic yards of it, to make one flat platform. Whatever lay on that ground before was buried under many feet of fill. By the 1940s, that older landscape had faded from memory. Pius XII now understood that Pius XI's burial wish had opened the one place no one had dared to open before, the very ground under the high altar. Quietly, in the middle of a world war, he allowed a full archaeological dig to go ahead. A small team of archaeologists joined the Sampietrini. As they cut through the old vaulting from Constantine's church and went lower, they realized they were standing on separate flat roofs. Each roof belonged to a brick box below. These boxes were tomb houses, small mausoleums from a Roman cemetery, pressed together under the basilica floor. Bit by bit, the team opened passages between the roofs, propped up the weight above, and dropped down into the rooms below. They found themselves on what looked like a narrow street frozen in time, running roughly east to west under the nave. On both sides stood rows of brick tomb buildings, mostly from the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Some had simple fronts. Others had carved frames around the door and painted plaster on the walls. Inside, the rooms were rich and strange. Floors in several tombs were covered with fine mosaics. One famous example shows a chariot racing forward, built out of tiny colored tiles. The walls held paintings of peacocks, grapevines, and mythological scenes. In one large tomb, now known as the Tomb of the Valerii, marble panels carry long Latin inscriptions listing names and family ties of the people buried there. Niches in the walls hold urns with ashes. Long, narrow pipes run from the street level down into the tombs so that relatives could pour wine, oil, or honey into the grave during memorial meals. This was a neighborhood for the dead that was meant to be visited. They were tiny house-like rooms for the afterlife, lined up along the street with doors, benches, and little stone altars for offerings. Together, they formed a tight, crowded city of the dead, below what would later become the center of the Catholic world. Most of the tombs the team uncovered were pagan. Their carvings and paintings showed classic Roman gods and symbols. Some statues honored Bacchus, the god of wine. Others carried designs borrowed from Egypt and Greece. In at least one case, an inscription scolded careless visitors and begged them to treat the tomb with respect. From the inscriptions, archaeologists could read family names like the Valeri and the Caetani and see how the cemetery had grown. The oldest mausoleums, along one side of the street, went back to the 1st and early 2nd centuries. Later tombs squeezed into any remaining space, even at odd angles, as new generations tried to stay close to their ancestors. Inscriptions also mention work connected to a large entertainment area that once stood nearby, a place later known for its races and public shows. For Pius XII, this buried city was not only a marvel of Roman history, it was also a possible answer to a much older question. Since the early centuries of the Church, Christians in Rome had said that the Apostle Peter was buried on this hill. To grasp what these workers had really opened up, you have to step back from the tombs themselves and look at the hill they stood on, in the centuries before any church was ever built there. The dark history of Vatican Hill. When most people think of the Vatican, they picture a clean stone square and a huge church on a hill. It is hard to imagine that same hill as the worst address in ancient Rome, but for a long time, that is exactly what it was. In Roman times, the land on this side of the river was called the Ager Vaticanus, the Vatican Field. It sat on the west bank of the Tiber, across from the main city, in the low area between the river and a small hill that later became Vatican Hill. The place flooded often. After big rains, the river spilled over and left behind standing pools and clouds of insects. Ancient writers describe this side as unhealthy and gloomy, the kind of place where poor people lived far from the busy heart of Rome. Even the wine from these slopes had a bad reputation. The name Vatican itself points to something else that made this land feel strange. Ancient authors give different ideas about where the word came from, but several of them link it to vates, a word for a seer or prophet, and to vaticenia, prophetic sayings. Later scholars also think it may echo an old Etruscan place name in this area. Long before a church stood here, people already saw this slope as a place of omens. Before Rome rose to power, the Etruscans were the big force in central Italy. They watched lightning, bird flight, and the livers of sacrificed animals to read what the gods wanted. Roman writers say that this Etruscan art of divination was one of the main religious skills that Rome borrowed from its neighbors, and some of that knowledge was thought to come from this side of the river. In people's minds, the Vatican slope was not just cheap farmland. It was already marked off as religious ground. Things changed in a dramatic way during one of Rome's worst crises. In the 2nd century BC, when the city was locked in a war with Carthage and the general Hannibal, the Senate turned to its secret guide, the Sibylline Books, a set of sacred texts of prophecies. The priests came back with a strange answer. Rome, they said, had to bring in a foreign mother goddess from the mountains of what is now Turkey. Her Greek name was Cybele. Romans called her Magna Mater, the Great Mother. The Senate sent envoys to the king of Pergamon and asked for her sacred symbol, a dark stone that people believed had fallen from the sky. In the year 204 BC, that stone arrived at the mouth of the Tiber and was carried into Rome with ceremony. From then on, Cybele's worship was part of the state religion. Her main temple rose on the Palatine Hill, but her reach did not stop there. In time, a special sanctuary of the Great Mother, known as the Phrygianum, grew up on or near Vatican Hill, and later inscriptions show that this Vatican sanctuary was famous enough that other cities copied its name. Cybele's rites were nothing like the calm public sacrifices most Romans were used to. Her festivals were loud and wild. Drums, flutes, and clashing cymbals filled the air. Her priests, called Galli, were eunuchs. Ancient writers describe them dancing in a frenzy, and even wounding themselves as a sign of total devotion. The extremes of the cult frightened many Romans, and for a long time, Roman citizens were not allowed to become Galli. Yet this foreign mother cult had one of its main bases right on the Vatican slope. Cybele was not alone. As the empire spread, Rome soaked up new gods from across its borders. One of the most important for soldiers was Mithras, a god with roots in the east. The cult of Mithras was secret. Instead of big open temples, it used small underground rooms called Mithraea. built to feel like caves, with an image of Mithras killing a bull at one end. Archaeologists have found many Mithraea under modern buildings in Rome. A clear example lies under the Church of San Clemente, where an early Christian church sits above a Mithraic cave temple from the 1st centuries AD. That stacked pattern, pagan cult space below and Christian worship above, also fits what later happened on Vatican Hill. We do not have a confirmed Mithric temple under St. Peter's, but it would not be surprising if some form of Mithras worship once took place somewhere on or near this slope, given how common these shrines were in the city. By the 1st century AD, this bad side of the river had started to fill with imperial gardens and new buildings. Agrippina the Elder, the powerful mother of the future Emperor Caligula, owned large estates here. After her death, Caligula took over the land and decided to build something big, a private racetrack. He laid out a long, narrow stadium for chariot races in the Vatican Plain. Later, it would be known as the Circus of Gaius and Nero. To decorate the spine that ran down the middle of his circus, Caligula wanted a single, gigantic trophy. He ordered an obelisk to be taken from Heliopolis in Egypt, a city famous for its sun temples. Roman engineers shipped the stone all the way across the Mediterranean and up the Tiber. The obelisk is about 83 feet tall, and with its base and later cross, it stands over 130 feet. That stone is still there. It once stood in the center of Caligula's circus. In the late 1500s, workers moved it a short distance to the front of the new basilica, where it now rises in the middle of St. Peter's Square. It watched pagan races, cruel shows, and later Christian ceremonies, all from the same hill. Caligula's successor, Nero, took over the circus and the gardens around it. In the year 64 AD, a terrible fire broke out in Rome. Roman historian Tacitus says it burned for several days and damaged or destroyed much of the city. People whispered that Nero himself had ordered the fire so that he could rebuild the streets as he wanted. To save himself, he needed someone else to blame. He chose a small disliked group, the Christians. Tacitus, who was no friend of Christians, writes that Nero accused them of hatred of the human race and punished them with special cruelty. On the Vatican side, in the Circus of Gaius and Nero, Christians were sewn into animal skins and thrown to dogs, nailed to crosses, or set on fire as living torches to light the emperor's gardens at night. Christian tradition says that the leader of the Roman Christians, Peter, was caught up in this wave of violence. Because he was not a Roman citizen, he faced crucifixion. Later stories say that he asked to be crucified upside down, saying he did not deserve to die in the same way as Jesus. Roman law did not allow burials inside the old city limits, so cemeteries formed along the roads just outside that line. The Vatican slope was one of those border areas. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, families started building tombs along a road that passed by the circus, likely the old Via Cornelia. Pagan families used this stretch, and later Christian families did too. For many Christians, the reason was that they wanted to be buried as close as possible to the spot where they believed Peter had died and been laid to rest. Over time, the hillside filled up with mausoleums and smaller graves, stacked in terraces as the land climbed away from the river. Centuries later, when builders and diggers finally reached that buried street again, they were not just walking into a random Roman graveyard. They were standing on a hill that had been a swamp, an imperial racetrack, a killing ground for Nero's victims, and a burial zone that Christians believed held their leading apostle. The next question was the most personal one of all. In that maze of tombs, was Peter himself still there? Hunting Peter's tomb under the altar. Pope Pius XII followed the dig closely. Early Christian writers said that Peter's grave was on this hill and that an old shrine once marked it. Later builders had always placed the main altar of St. Peter's over that line, so Pius told his experts to focus on the area directly beneath it. In the church above, there is a lowered space in front of the papal altar where people go down a few steps to pray. It is called the Confessio. Tradition says this is as close as you can get to Peter's tomb. The archaeologists working in the necropolis below wanted to see what sat under that point. As they followed the narrow underground street, they saw that the row of large tomb buildings came to an abrupt stop near the center. In the middle of all those brick houses of the dead, there was a small open patch that looked rough and poor by comparison, as if it had been left clear on purpose. When they cleared this patch, they uncovered a wall that had once held back the hillside. It dated from about the middle of the 2nd century AD and was covered in a red plaster wash, so the team called it the Red Wall. Set against this red surface was a tiny marble monument, 2 small columns holding up a little stone shelf, like a small table built into the wall. It was a small shrine. Next to the shrine, parts of the wall had been smoothed with plaster. The archaeologists saw that this plaster was covered with scratches. There were bits of Greek and Latin, short names, and simple signs. At first it looked like random graffiti, but it slowly became clear that it was a stream of tiny prayers. In a time when faith could still be risky, believers had come down here and quickly scratched messages near the shrine. Some lines asked Peter to pray for them. Some used early Christian symbols like a fish or an anchor. Whatever lay below, people by the 3rd and 4th centuries clearly thought Peter was here. The next step was simple. The team opened the ground directly under the little marble table of the shrine, expecting to find a clear grave with a body. Instead, they found a plain grave cut into the soil, but no complete skeleton resting in place. Any bones that had once been there seemed to have been disturbed or removed. This gap between the signs and the remains created real tension. At this point, the role of one man, Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, became very important. Kaas was a German priest and former politician. In the Vatican, he served as administrator of St. Peter's. He controlled access to the site and reported to the Pope. He was not trained as an archaeologist, but he was the one in charge on the church side. Over time, tensions grew between Kaas and members of the scientific team, such as Father Antonio Ferrua. The archaeologists wanted open notes and shared decisions. Kaas worried about rumors and about anything that might shake ordinary believers. He kept a tight hold on information and on the handling of finds. In that atmosphere, a serious mistake happened. In one tomb not far from the central area, workers uncovered a jumble of bones. The tomb belonged to a pagan family and sat off to the side, not in the small open area near the shrine. To the archaeologists, these bones were just part of the general cemetery. To Kaas, they felt special. Convinced for personal reasons that this mixed pile might be the long-sought remains of Peter, he quietly had them collected, placed in a box, and stored away in a private place. When specialists later examined that box, the result was clear and awkward. The bones did not belong to one man. They came from several different humans. Reports describe bones from at least one woman, and from farm animals such as sheep and pigs, along with even a mouse. The episode did not prove that Peter had never been buried on the hill, but it showed how easily faith and control can get tangled up with science. While attention was fixed on this wrong box, another discovery, much closer to the shrine itself, passed almost without notice. During the clearing of the Red Wall, one of the lead excavators, Bruno Maria Apollonge-Getty, and a workman uncovered a small recess built right into the wall near the shrine. It was lined with marble, like a stone drawer inside the brick. Inside this hidden space were human bones. The workman carefully picked them up, put them in a wooden box, and, following instructions, placed the box in a Vatican storeroom. The find was recorded, but because Kaas was focused on the other bones he favored, this box never became the center of attention. It was just one more set of remains from a crowded hill, listed in the notes and then left on a shelf. By the early 1950s, the first phase of the dig drew to a close. Now the Pope had to tell the world what had been found. In his Christmas radio address in 1950, Pius XII said that the tomb of the Apostle Peter had been located. He stopped short of claiming that the bones of Peter had been proved beyond doubt. For most listeners, it seemed as if the story ended there. The hill under St. Peter's had given up a pagan cemetery, a central memorial, an empty grave, and a confusing trail of bones. Almost no one outside a small circle knew that, in a plain wooden box from a niche in the red wall, there were still more bones waiting for someone to look at them again. The final clue that pointed to Peter. The question of where Peter's bones were still hung in the air when a new figure entered the story. Her name was Margherita Guarducci. She was an Italian scholar from Florence, a specialist in ancient writing, especially Greek inscriptions scratched or carved on stone. She taught at the University of Rome and had already built a strong reputation in her field. In the early 1950s, she was invited to study the inscriptions and graffiti in the small underground cemetery beneath the basilica. The first excavation team had mapped the tombs and walls and written their big report, but the quick notes and scratch marks that visitors had left on the plaster had not yet been studied in depth. That was now her job. She spent years in those tight, damp spaces under the church, standing by dim lights, copying letters onto paper, and trying to make sense of messy lines that crossed over each other. Most people who had seen the walls before her had noticed a few clear phrases like, "Peter, pray for us," in Greek or Latin. They took those as a general sign that early Christians honored Peter somewhere in that zone, but did not push much further. Guarducci thought the picture was richer. She saw that many marks were grouped in one tight area near the little shrine and the red wall at the center of the cemetery. To her, it looked as if believers had focused their prayers on that precise spot, not just anywhere in the necropolis. Then she came across a fragment that changed her thinking. On one piece of plaster from near the shrine, there were only a few letters, and they were hard to read. Earlier, another member of the team had also noticed them and suggested they could be Greek letters spelling something about Peter. Guarducci studied the fragment in detail and agreed with the reading that saw the words as Petros eini, which in simple Greek means Peter is within or Peter is here. That short phrase looks simple, but it carries a lot of meaning. Within could mean within the wall, within the shrine, or within this exact sacred spot. If that reading is right, it sounds like a 3rd century or 4th century visitor, quietly leaving a message that Peter is not only honored there in memory. It suggests that Peter's actual remains are inside the structure, not somewhere else on the hill. Not every scholar agrees with this reading, and some propose different ways to split the letters. Once Guarducci was convinced that the graffiti were sending a strong message about Peter's presence, she began to ask another simple, direct question. What had happened to every bone that had ever been taken from that area? She wanted to trace each set of remains, find where they were stored, and see if any had been overlooked. During her questions, a veteran Vatican workman, one of the Sanpietrini who had helped in the early digging, told her something important. He remembered gathering bones from a small marble-lined recess, a cavity cut into the support wall close to the shrine, and placing them in a box years earlier. That box, he said, had been put away in a storeroom and then forgotten. Guarducci asked to see the box. When it was opened, it held bone fragments that had not been part of the mixed collection already judged to include several people and animals. These were different. The note on the container said they came from the niche in the wall near the shrine. This meant they might come from a second burial, where bones from an earlier grave in the ground were collected and carefully placed inside the wall during a later building stage, possibly when Constantine rebuilt the whole area above the grave. Under Guarducci's direction, the bones from this wall niche were given to experts to study. The work took years. The main anthropologist, Professor Venerando Correnti of Palermo, examined the fragments under a microscope and measured them in detail. His report, published in the 1960s, said that, as far as he could tell, they came from one man, not several different people. The man seemed to be of strong build and had died at about 60 to 70 years of age. That age range fits the usual guess for how old Peter might have been when he was killed under Nero. Correnti also noted that the bones had first lain in earth and then been moved later, which matched the idea of an original grave being disturbed and the remains being carefully lifted into the niche. There was another detail that impressed Guarducci. Tiny bits of cloth fiber were stuck to some of the bones. Tests showed that the cloth had been dyed a rich purple color and woven with gold thread. In the Roman world, purple and gold cloth was extremely expensive and linked to honor and high status. The pattern of the fibers suggested that the bones had been wrapped in this fabric like a bundle, not dressed in it as clothes, which is the way people often treat relics they want to protect and display with respect. Once she had this chain of clues, Guarducci felt confident that she had found the remains of Peter. She wrote books and articles, laying out her case and shared her findings with church leaders. After reviewing the work and consulting other experts, Pope Paul VI made a public announcement in June of 1968. In a general audience, he said that new, very careful studies and the judgment of skilled and prudent people allowed him to believe that the relics of St. Peter had been identified convincingly. Not everyone agreed with Guarducci. Some of the archaeologists who had led the original excavation, including Father Antonio Ferrua, never accepted her reading of the graffiti or her conclusion about the bones. They pointed out gaps in the early records. They worried about how exactly the box had been handled and labeled in the first years of the dig. In November of 2013, during a special mass, Pope Francis held a bronze case that contained 9 small bone fragments from this set and showed them to the faithful in St. Peter's Square. It was the first time these pieces had been displayed so openly. The act did not end the debate, but it showed again how much spiritual weight the Church gives to these remains, whatever a future scientist may yet say. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.